48 hours earlier, I thought I was the luckiest woman in Hartwell, Connecticut. I thought my husband had planned the most romantic gift of our marriage. I had no idea he was giving me something else entirely, a front row seat to the end of everything I thought I had built. My name is Claire Whitfield. I was 38 years old, and until that Thursday afternoon, I believed I knew exactly who my husband was. Let me start where it actually began, 12 years earlier, in a much smaller life, before the house, before the company, before any of it had a name. I met Daniel Whitfield when I was 26, working marketing for a mid-sized firm in Stamford and hating almost every hour of it. He was 29, freshly out of a failed first attempt at flipping houses, sleeping on his cousin's pull-out couch, and talking about real estate the way other men talk about religion. He had a folder of hand-drawn renovation plans and a spreadsheet of numbers that didn't yet work. What he had, more than anything, was certainty. I had never met anyone so certain about a future that didn't exist yet. I left my job 18 months later to help him build Whitfield Property Group. I brought the marketing skills, the client relationships, the instinct for which houses could be turned around and which were money pits dressed up in fresh paint. He brought the drive and the charm that made banks say yes when they should have said no. We were a team before we were a marriage. We closed our first 6-unit renovation in the same month we got engaged, and for years, that felt like the truest kind of love story, two people who built something with their own hands and then built a life on top of it. By our 5th anniversary, Whitfield Property Group had 11 employees and a name that meant something in 3 counties. By our 8th, Daniel was the one giving keynote talks at real estate conferences, the one whose photo appeared in the regional business journal under headlines like "Self-Made and Still Rising." I want to be honest with you about something, because this is where so many of these stories start going wrong long before anyone notices. Somewhere around year 8, I stopped being called a co-founder. I became Daniel's wife in conversations, the woman behind the man in one particularly grating magazine profile, and eventually, without any single dramatic moment I could point to, I became someone who used to work in the business. It happened so gradually I almost didn't clock it. A meeting I wasn't invited to because it was just logistics. A decision about a property acquisition made and announced to me after the fact. A joint bank account that quietly became the household account while a separate, much larger account existed for the business, which I technically co-owned on paper but had less and less visibility into with each passing year. If you have ever been in a marriage like this, you know the strange emotional math of it. Every single one of these moments, on its own, was small enough to excuse. He's busy. He's stressed. He didn't mean it like that. It's easier if I just handle it. You tell yourself these things because the alternative, admitting that the partnership you built your entire identity around has quietly become something else, is too heavy to hold on a random Tuesday while you're also trying to get dinner on the table. I am telling you all of this because you need to understand who I was on the Thursday Daniel came home early with flowers and an announcement that, at the time, felt like the sweetest thing he had done for me in years. "Pack a bag for 4 days," he said, setting a bouquet of white peonies on the kitchen island like a man closing a deal. "Somewhere warm. Somewhere quiet. You've been running yourself into the ground for this company for 12 years, and our anniversary is in 5 days, and I want to give you something that's just for you." I laughed, genuinely delighted, and asked where. "That's the surprise," he said. "I already booked it. Flights, resort, everything. All you have to do is show up and let someone else take care of you for once." I want you to notice something here, because I certainly didn't at the time. Daniel Whitfield did not do surprises. In 12 years of marriage, every gift he had ever given me had been discussed, priced, and half negotiated in advance, because that was how his mind worked. He trusted plans, not spontaneity. A 4-day solo trip, booked entirely without my input, arriving 5 days before our anniversary instead of on it, should have registered as strange. Instead, it registered as romantic. That is the particular cruelty of trust. It doesn't just make you vulnerable to the people who betray it. It makes you grateful while they're doing it. There was one detail that snagged, just slightly, in the back of my mind. The trip was for me alone. When I asked, half joking, if he was coming, he said the business needed him that week, a closing on the Millbrook Avenue property, contractors, the usual. He'd join the following week for our actual anniversary dinner. Think of this as the appetizer, he said. I wanted you to have something that's just yours before we celebrate together. I chose to believe every word of it, because believing it was so much easier than the alternative, and because 12 years of marriage had trained me to interpret any hint of distance as busyness rather than deception. I packed a bag. I kissed my husband goodbye at the door on Sunday morning. And I flew to a boutique resort on the Georgia coast, alone, carrying a knot in my stomach I told myself was just excitement. The resort was, by any objective measure, beautiful. White cottages along a marsh, a spa built into old live oaks, a private stretch of beach that belonged only to guests. I should have felt like the luckiest woman alive. Instead, I spent the first night lying awake, staring at a ceiling fan, trying to name the feeling sitting in my chest. It wasn't until the second morning that the feeling got a name. I was having coffee on my cottage porch when my phone buzzed with a calendar notification, one of those automatic ones, generated from an email confirmation, the kind you never manually set yourself. It read, "Reminder, movers arrive 9 a.m. Thursday, Whitfield residence." My first thought was that it was a mistake. We weren't moving. We hadn't discussed moving. I opened my email and found the confirmation buried 3 days deep in my inbox, sent to an account Daniel and I technically shared for household logistics but which he almost never used, which meant he had either forgotten I had access, or hadn't thought to check. Premier Moving Solutions. Full-service residential move. Thursday, 9 a.m. One item stood out in the inventory notes: client requests discretion, spouse unaware of scheduling, please coordinate arrival directly with on-site contact, Simone Alvarez. I read that sentence 4 times. Spouse unaware. On-site contact, Simone Alvarez. I did not know anyone named Simone Alvarez. And yet this stranger had apparently been given the authority to coordinate the movement of items out of my house while I was 3 states away on a trip my husband had personally arranged to get me out of it. I want to pause here and tell you what I did not do. I did not call Daniel screaming. I did not book a flight home that morning in a blind panic. Something colder and more useful took over instead, the same instinct that had once told me which renovation deals were traps dressed up as opportunities. I had learned, over 12 years in a business built on contracts and fine print, that panic makes you sloppy, and sloppy people lose. So instead, I made one phone call. Not to my husband. To my closest friend since college, a woman named Monica Reyes, who happened to also be a family law attorney with an office 20 minutes from my house. Monica picked up on the second ring, the way she always did when she sensed something in your voice before you said a word. Claire. What's wrong? I read her the email. The whole thing, the movers, the discretion, the name Simone Alvarez. There was a long pause on the line, the kind of pause that told me she was already 3 steps ahead of me, doing the mental math of a professional who has seen this exact story unfold 100 times with 100 different names. Do you remember 8 months ago, she finally said, when you came to my office and asked me, off the record, what your position actually was if something ever happened between you and Daniel? Financially. Legally. In the business? I remembered. I remembered it painfully well, because at the time I had felt almost embarrassed asking, like I was betraying Daniel simply by wondering. It had started with something small, a comment Daniel made at a dinner party, joking to a business partner that the company's mine, Claire just makes it look good, delivered with a laugh that made everyone else laugh too. I'd smiled along with the room. But I hadn't been able to shake it for weeks afterward. So I'd gone to Monica, quietly, almost guiltily, and asked her to look into exactly what my name was actually attached to after 12 years of marriage and a business we had supposedly built together. What she found, back then, had alarmed me enough to act. Whitfield Property Group had been restructured 4 years earlier, a routine-sounding tax and liability move that Daniel had explained to me at the time in about 90 seconds over dinner, and which I had signed off on without reading past the summary page, Because I trusted him and because I was, frankly, exhausted from a week of my own work. That restructuring had quietly shifted majority ownership into Daniel's name alone, with my involvement redefined on paper as a minority stakeholder and, in one clause, as holding a general power of attorney in his favor for administrative efficiency, a clause that, if triggered under the right circumstances, would let him make sweeping decisions about shared property without requiring my signature at all. At Monica's advice 8 months ago, I had done 3 quiet things. I had filed formal paperwork asserting and documenting my original founding contributions to the business, with financial records to support it. I had revoked the outdated power of attorney and replaced it with nothing, meaning any major transaction involving jointly held assets now legally required both our signatures again. And I had opened a private account, in my name only, where I had been slowly, unremarkably moving a portion of my own earnings from the business for 8 months, not out of paranoia, Monica had told me at the time, but out of simple financial self-respect. Every working adult should have that, marriage or not. I had done all of this quietly. I had never told Daniel. Part of me had felt guilty about it for months, like I was preparing for a betrayal I didn't actually believe was coming. Sitting on that porch in Georgia, phone in hand, I understood for the first time why Monica had insisted I not feel guilty at all. "Claire," she said now, her voice steady in a way that steadied me too. "Whatever is happening at that house right now, you are in a far stronger position than you think. But I need you to come home. Today. And I need you to let me come with you." I did not sleep on the flight back. I did not cry, either, which surprised me. What I felt instead was a strange, focused clarity, the same feeling I used to get walking through a property I already knew, on some level, we shouldn't buy, a calm, almost clinical awareness that the version of my life I'd been living in was already gone, and the only decision left was how I chose to walk through what came next. Monica met me at the airport. We didn't talk much in the car. She had brought a folder, the kind of folder that meant she had spent the last several hours making calls I hadn't asked her to make, the way good friends and good lawyers sometimes do at the exact same time. "I called the moving company directly," she said, eyes on the road. "Told them I was Mrs. Whitfield's attorney and that any transfer of jointly held property required both owners' authorization under Connecticut law, and that proceeding without it would expose them to liability." They weren't thrilled. But they agreed to hold off on removing anything from the master suite, the office, and anywhere business documents were stored until ownership was confirmed. "And the house itself?" "The house is titled to both of you. He can't sell it, transfer it, or empty it without your signature. Whatever he's doing today, Claire, he's doing it because he's betting you won't find out until it's finished. He's betting on the version of you from 8 months ago. Not the one sitting in this car." I want to tell you that hearing this made me feel triumphant. It didn't, not yet. Mostly it made me feel sick, in the particular way that discovering the shape of a betrayal feels different from suspecting it. Suspicion is smoke. This was fire, and I was about to walk directly into it. We turned onto my street a little after 2 in the afternoon. And there it was, the moving truck, hazard lights blinking, my grandmother's writing desk halfway down the front steps, and a woman I had never met standing at my front door with a clipboard, giving instructions inside my own home like she had lived there for years. She saw the car before I was even fully out of it. Something crossed her face, not fear exactly, more like recalculation, the look of someone whose plan has just acquired a variable it hadn't accounted for. "You must be Claire," she said, and there was no apology in it. If anything, there was a strange, brittle politeness, the kind people use when they've convinced themselves they're the reasonable one in a situation they know isn't reasonable at all. "I must be," I said. "And you are?" "Simone. I work with Daniel." "Do you?" I said. "Because the moving company's paperwork had you listed as the on-site contact for emptying my house. That's an interesting job description for someone who works with my husband." To her credit, she didn't flinch much. Later I would learn that Simone Alvarez had been hired 11 months earlier as an operations consultant for Whitfield Property Group, brought in, officially, to streamline back-office logistics. Unofficially, somewhere in those 11 months, streamlining had apparently come to include streamlining Daniel's marriage as well. I won't spend long on the affair itself in this story, because the affair, as painful as it was to confirm standing on my own porch that afternoon, was almost the smaller betrayal. The bigger one was still inside the house, spread across the dining table Daniel and I had eaten 1,000 dinners on. I walked past her. Monica walked with me. And there, on that table, was a stack of documents that told me everything the moving truck hadn't already. Daniel had drafted a full asset restructuring agreement. Reading it later with Monica line by line, we understood exactly what he had been attempting to build in the 4 days I was gone. The plan relied on that old power of attorney clause, the one I had quietly revoked 8 months earlier without his knowledge. Under the version of our arrangement Daniel still believed was active, he could authorize the sale of 2 rental properties held jointly in our names, move the proceeds into a newly formed entity, one that, according to the paperwork, listed Simone Alvarez as a 20% partner, and finalize all of it while I was 3 states away, unreachable except by the phone I had, fortunately, never once turned off. The house itself wasn't being sold. I want to be clear about that, because I know some of you are picturing him trying to sell the roof over my head, and that's not quite what this was. What he was doing was smaller and, in its own way, colder, quietly emptying it of anything of significant value, art, furniture, a safe containing jewelry that had been my grandmother's, documents from the early years of the business that proved my original financial contributions, while the legal groundwork was laid to redirect our shared wealth into a structure I had no claim to at all. By the time I was scheduled to come home for our anniversary dinner, the plan appears to have been for me to return to a house that still looked, on the surface, like my home, while the actual value inside it, the value we had spent 12 years building, had already been moved somewhere I couldn't reach it. I have thought many times since about what would have happened if I hadn't opened that calendar notification on the porch. If I hadn't made that call to Monica 8 months earlier out of something I could barely admit to myself was suspicion. I think about the version of me who might have flown home a week later, hugged her husband at an anniversary dinner, and never known how close she came to losing everything quietly, with a smile on her face the entire time. He arrived at 6 that evening, walking in with the loose, satisfied energy of a man who believed his week had gone according to plan. I watched his face change in real time as he took in the scene, Monica seated at the dining table with the documents spread in front of her, me standing by the window with my arms crossed, Simone frozen by the staircase like she'd forgotten which way the exits were. Claire. He said my name like a question he already knew the answer to. You weren't supposed to be back until the plan was finished, I said. I know. I read the email, Daniel. The one that specifically said your spouse was unaware. I watched him try 3 different faces in the space of about 10 seconds, indignation, then a kind of wounded confusion, like he was the one who'd been caught off guard by something unfair, and finally, when none of that landed, something closer to the truth. Tired. Cornered. A man who had built an entire second version of his life on the assumption that the first version would never look too closely. It's not what you think, he started, and I actually laughed, not because anything was funny, but because I don't think there has ever been a sentence spoken in the history of marriage that successfully followed those 5 words with good news. Here's what I think, I said. I think you decided somewhere in the last year that I was worth less to this business than I actually am. I think you found someone willing to help you act on that. And I think you were counting on a piece of paper from 4 years ago to let you move our life without my signature, because you assumed I'd never bother to check what that paper actually said. I nodded to Monica. She didn't say anything dramatic. She simply slid one document across the table, the revocation, filed and notarized 8 months earlier, his own signature on the original nowhere near it, because he'd never needed to sign off on me protecting myself. That was the moment his face actually changed. Not from anger to guilt. From confidence to arithmetic. He was doing the math on what this actually meant, and I watched him arrive, syllable by syllable, at the correct answer. Here is what unraveled over the following months, because these stories rarely end in a single dramatic scene, no matter how satisfying that would be to tell you. The restructuring agreement Daniel had drafted was void without my authorization, which meant every property, every account, every dollar of value we had built together over 12 years remained exactly where it had legally always been, jointly held, jointly owned, requiring both our names to move. Monica helped me pursue what I was entitled to, and because I had spent 8 quiet months documenting my original contributions to Whitfield Property Group, the negotiation was not the drawn-out, humiliating fight Daniel might have once assumed he could win simply by being the one whose name appeared on the letterhead. In the settlement that followed our divorce, I retained my full ownership stake in the business, a stake I ultimately sold back to Daniel at fair market value over the following year, because I no longer wanted to build anything alongside a man who had tried to build me out of the picture entirely. I kept the house. I kept my grandmother's writing desk, which the movers, in the end, never took past the front steps. And I kept something else, something that took longer to name than any of the financial details, the understanding that I had, without fully realizing it, spent 8 months protecting a version of myself I hadn't yet admitted I might need. Simone Alvarez's operations consulting arrangement with Whitfield Property Group ended, unsurprisingly, the same week the settlement was finalized. What happened between her and Daniel after that isn't really part of this story, because by then it had stopped being my business in every sense of the word. I've told this story publicly now because I've heard some version of it more times than I can count since it happened to me, different names, different houses, different amounts of money, but the same quiet architecture underneath. A partnership built by 2 people slowly becomes a business owned by one. A marriage built on trust becomes a legal structure only one person still fully understands. And somewhere in the middle of it, the person losing ground is usually the last one to notice, because noticing would mean admitting that the story they've been telling themselves about their own marriage isn't quite true anymore. If there's one thing I would ask you to sit with after hearing this, it isn't suspicion of the people you love. It's this: protecting yourself financially inside a marriage is not an act of distrust. It is an act of self-respect, and it costs you nothing until the day it costs you everything not to have done it. Know what you own. Know what's in your name and what isn't. Ask the uncomfortable questions about restructurings and power of attorney clauses before you're standing in a driveway watching strangers carry your grandmother's desk down your own front steps. I did not go looking for a reason to distrust my husband. I went looking for the truth, and it turned out the truth had been sitting quietly in a filing cabinet the entire time, waiting for me to ask. 12 years of my life were built on a foundation I thought was shared equally. It wasn't, not for a long time before I found out. But the 8 months I spent quietly, unglamorously protecting what was actually mine turned out to matter more than the 12 years that came before them. I hope you never need to use what I'm telling you. But if you ever find yourself sitting on a porch somewhere, reading an email that doesn't quite make sense, trust that feeling in your stomach. Make the call. Ask the question. However this story landed for you, I'd love to hear which part of it hit closest to home. Write it in the comments, and if stories like this one matter to you, subscribe and follow, because there are more.